In 2025, the Nemours Foundation operates children's hospitals in Delaware and Florida. They treat thousands of sick children annually. They fund medical research, they provide health care to families who cannot afford it, and every single year, they spend $3.5 million maintaining an empty mansion in Wilmington that almost no one visits. The estate cannot be sold. The math is simple and brutal. Annual operating costs run between $3 and $4 million. Admission revenue, event rentals, and gift shop sales generate maybe $800,000. The foundation loses $2.5 to $3.5 million every year. Over the past 55 years, that deficit has consumed somewhere between $125 and $175 million. Money that could have treated thousands of children. Money that could have built hospital wings, or funded research, or provided care to families in crisis. Instead, it maintains 77 rooms, 9 Carrara marble bathrooms, and gardens that require $500,000 annually just to keep the hedges trimmed. The foundation cannot walk away. Jessie Ball DuPont's will, written in the 1960s, mandates that the estate be preserved and open to the public. Her endowment funds both children's health care and the mansion's maintenance. Breaking the will would require years of expensive litigation with no guarantee of success. Donor intent is sacred in trust law. She meant well. She wanted to honor her husband's memory while helping Delaware's children. What she created was a financial trap that persists nearly a century after his death. Alfred I DuPont built Nemours to prove he didn't need his family's approval. He succeeded. The French château he erected in 1910 still stands as one of America's finest examples of Beaux-Arts architecture. The gardens rank among the most spectacular formal landscapes in the country, and the curse he unleashed by building something too expensive to maintain and too significant to abandon continues to burden every generation that inherits the responsibility. This is the story of how spite, love, and ambition combined to create a palace that became a prison. Before we dive into how one man's wounded pride created a burden that still exists today, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. I'm always curious where these stories of American wealth and architecture reach across the country and the world. And if you're not subscribed, hit that button. These estates have histories most people never hear. The DuPont family didn't start in Delaware. They started in France, and they brought with them an aristocratic pride that would eventually destroy them from within. Eleuthère Irénée Dupont arrived in America in 1800, carrying gunpowder formulas and French aristocratic pretensions. His father had been a government official before the Revolution. The family fled when the Terror began executing anyone with noble connections. They landed in America with little money but considerable knowledge. A. Dupont understood chemistry. More importantly, he understood that the young American Republic would need explosives. He established his gunpowder mills in 1802 on the Brandywine River near Wilmington, Delaware. The location was strategic. Water power from the river drove the machinery. Access to Philadelphia and Baltimore markets was easy, and the isolation protected nearby residents when things went wrong. Things went wrong regularly. Gunpowder manufacturing was among the most dangerous industries in America. Explosions were not a matter of if, but when. The business grew through war. The War of 1812 brought government contracts. The Mexican-American War brought more. When the Civil War began in 1861, DuPont supplied both sides initially, until the Union blockade made Southern shipments impossible. Each conflict fattened the family fortune. By 1880, the company dominated American explosives manufacturing. By 1900, DuPont controlled between 85 and 90% of the market. This was monopoly power on the scale of Standard Oil or U.S. Steel. The family didn't just make explosives. They controlled Delaware politics. They owned banks. They built railroads. Governors consulted them before making decisions. Senators represented their interests in Washington. Delaware was effectively a company state, and the company was DuPont. The family structure reinforced this concentration of wealth and power. Cousins married cousins. Brothers married sisters of other DuPont brothers. The family tree looked less like a tree and more like a tightly woven net designed to prevent wealth from escaping. Estates lined the Brandywine River. Each generation built something grander than the last. Competition within the family was fierce but conducted behind closed doors. By 1900, the company was worth millions. The family controlled hundreds of millions in assets across Delaware and beyond. Multiple DuPont cousins ranked among America's wealthiest men. They had achieved something remarkable for immigrants who arrived with almost nothing a century earlier. They had become American aristocracy. In 1902, the senior partners who controlled the company decided it was time to sell. They were aging. Managing the business had become complicated. Competitors were circling. Better to sell to Laughlin and Rand Powder Company and retire wealthy than risk everything in continued competition. They had no idea that a 37-year-old with one deaf ear and a burning need to prove himself was about to take everything. Alfred I DuPont was born on May 12, 1864, with every advantage except the one that mattered most. He was the eldest son, but not the primary heir initially. His father, Eleuthère DuPont II, was a senior partner in the family business. Alfred grew up surrounded by wealth and expectations. He understood from childhood that DuPont were different. They were better. They were chosen. Then, on March 29, 1877, an explosion at the family gunpowder mills killed his father. Alfred was 13 years old. The blast was so powerful that windows shattered in Wilmington, 5 miles away. Workers' bodies were never found. His father simply vanished in fire and smoke and concussive force. The trauma shaped everything Alfred would become. He developed an obsession with industrial safety that bordered on compulsive. He also learned that wealth offered no protection against sudden, violent loss. He attended the Massachusetts Institute of Technology to study chemistry and engineering. He didn't finish. The family business called him back. In 1884, at age 20, he went to work in the powder mills alongside common laborers. This was unusual for a DuPont heir. Most cousins took management positions immediately. Alfred wanted to understand the work from the inside. He learned how to pack powder kegs. He learned how to maintain the grinding machinery. He learned what exploded and why. That same year, another explosion took his hearing. A blast in the mills damaged his left ear permanently. Over the following decades, his hearing deteriorated until he was nearly completely deaf by age 50. He used primitive hearing aids that amplified sound crudely. Conversations became difficult. Business meetings required written notes. The deafness isolated him socially and made him suspicious of people he couldn't hear clearly. Those who knew him later said the isolation fed his paranoia. But in the 1880s and 90s, Alfred rose through the company on genuine competence. He understood explosives chemistry better than most DuPont cousins. He invented safety improvements that reduced accidental deaths. He became superintendent of the Brandywine Mills. By 1900, he was respected within the family business, if not beloved. When the senior partners announced in 1902 that they intended to sell the entire company to competitors, Alfred saw an opportunity. He approached his cousins Coleman DuPont and Pierre DuPont with a proposal. Instead of letting outsiders buy the company, why not buy it themselves? Coleman was ambitious and charismatic. Pierre was financially brilliant and methodical. Alfred understood explosives and manufacturing. Together, they could run the company better than the old men ever had. They pulled off one of the most audacious leverage buyouts in American business history. They bought the entire A. DuPont de Nemours and Company for $12 million. They didn't have $12 million. They borrowed it, using the company's own assets as collateral. The company was worth far more than $12 million, but the old partners wanted out, and the cousins convinced them to accept the deal. Coleman became president. Pierre became treasurer. Alfred became vice president. They were all under 40 years old. They controlled one of America's largest industrial corporations. The partnership that saved the company would eventually destroy Alfred. But in 1902, he had everything. He had power. He had wealth. He had proven himself to the family that had initially doubted him. He had married his first wife, Bessie Gardner, in 1887. 4 children followed. The marriage was conventional, proper, exactly what a DuPont heir was expected to do. By the early 1900s, it was also loveless. They lived increasingly separate lives. Divorce was unthinkable for a family obsessed with social standing, and propriety. 19 years later, in 1906, Alfred did the unthinkable. The divorce was finalized. What he did next would turn his own family against him. In January of 1907, less than a year after his divorce, Alfred Irénée DuPont married Alicia Bradford Maddox. She was his cousin's wife. She had divorced her husband, also a DuPont, to marry Alfred. The scandal was immediate and total. Elite society in the early 20th century could sometimes forgive a discreet divorce. What they could not forgive was a DuPont stealing another DuPont's wife. Alicia was beautiful, vivacious, and ambitious. She loved society. She loved entertaining. She loved the admiration and status that came with being a DuPont. Her first husband had been steady but dull. Alfred was deaf but passionate. She chose passion. The family chose sides. Coleman DuPont and Pierre DuPont led the ostracism. These were Alfred's business partners, the men who had executed the buyout with him just 5 years earlier. They excluded Alfred and Alicia from family social events. They removed Alfred from certain company boards. They made clear that anyone who accepted Alicia socially would be shut out themselves. Most of the DuPont family complied. Philadelphia Mainline Society, which overlapped heavily with DuPont social circles, sided with the establishment. Proper families did not receive Alicia. Invitations stopped arriving. Old friends became suddenly unavailable. Alfred's response was characteristic. He would build something so magnificent that every DuPont in Delaware would see it and remember who they had cast out. Alicia encouraged this. She wanted a showplace. She wanted to establish her own social circle, independent of the family that rejected her. She wanted to prove that Alfred DuPont's wife needed no one's approval to live like royalty. In 1909, Alfred purchased 300 acres, just 2 miles from the original DuPont family seat, along the Brandywine River. The location was deliberate provocation. Every DuPont driving past would see his estate. He hired Carrère Hastings, the most prestigious architectural firm in America. His instructions were simple. Build a French château that would rival anything the family had built. Spare no expense. Make it perfect. He would call it Nemours, after the DuPont ancestral château in France. If the family wanted to deny him his heritage, he would claim it anyway. The name itself was an act of defiance. Carrère Hastings had designed the New York Public Library and mansions for the Fricks. They knew how to build for men who wanted immortality in limestone. John Mervyn Carrère and Thomas Hastings had trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. They specialized in Beaux-Arts classicism, the architectural style that combined French elegance with American ambition. They brought that sensibility to Nemours. The design drew directly from 18th century French chateau. Louis XVI style with a mansard roof, symmetrical facade, and elaborate stonework. Indiana limestone clad the entire exterior. The house would contain 77 rooms across 3 floors, 47,000 square feet of living space, a porte cochere at the entrance for carriages and automobiles, dormer windows breaking the roofline, stone balustrades, and decorative urns, every detail calculated to evoke Versailles transplanted to Delaware. Construction began in 1909. The main house took approximately 1 year to complete. This was remarkably fast for a structure of this scale and complexity. Hundreds of workers labored simultaneously. Italian stone carvers created the exterior details and carved the interior marble. French artisans installed paneling imported from actual French chateaux. Local craftsmen handled the heavy construction work. Alfred drove the project relentlessly. He had the money, he had the motivation, and he had something to prove. The materials came from across the world. Carrara marble from Italy lined 9 bathrooms. Rare woods, mahogany and walnut and oak paneled the major rooms. Crystal chandeliers shipped from France hung in every reception space. Sheffield silver hardware adorned the doors. The great hall rose 2 stories with a grand staircase and wrought iron railings. French doors opened from room to room, creating sightlines through the entire first floor. Marble floors featured geometric patterns. Hidden doors led to service corridors so servants could move through the house unseen. Alfred insisted on the finest modern amenities. An elevator served all 3 floors. Central heating kept the massive structure warm through Delaware winters. Early cooling systems, primitive by modern standards but revolutionary for 1910, made summers bearable. Every room had running water. The 9 marble bathrooms featured flushing toilets and porcelain fixtures. Most American hotels in 1910 couldn't offer such luxuries. The music room became one of the house's crown jewels. Alfred commissioned an Aeolian pipe organ with 100 ranks and thousands of pipes. Custom acoustics were built into the room's design. The organ could reproduce everything from solo performances to full orchestral arrangements. A trained organist could make the house itself sing. The basement held a bowling alley and a billiard room with carved ceilings. The conservatory attached to the main house functioned as a year-round greenhouse. Marble floors with built-in drains allowed for watering without damage. Temperature controls maintained the perfect environment for exotic plants. Fresh flowers could be supplied to the mansion daily, regardless of season. The construction cost ran between $2 and $3 million. In today's currency, approximately $63 to $95 million. This was just the house. The gardens would cost at least as much and take far longer to complete. Alfred hired Gabriel Masséna, a French landscape architect, to create formal gardens in the style of André Le Nôtre, who had designed Versailles. Masséna began work in 1910. The gardens would not be considered finished until 1932. 22 years of continuous development and refinement. The central feature was a vista running 1/3 of a mile from the mansion, through the gardens, to a reflecting pool. This was the longest formally aligned vista in North America. Maintaining that perfect alignment required constant topiary work and landscape management. Any tree or shrub that grew out of line disrupted the effect. At the far end of the vista stood a marble colonnade with 157 Carrara marble columns, imported from Italy. Sunken gardens featured geometric parterres planted with thousands of flowers, replanted seasonally. A maze garden used boxwood hedges trimmed to precise heights. Multiple reflecting pools, including one larger than a football field, created mirror images of the sky and surrounding landscape. Fountains with complex hydraulic systems required their own power source. The Achievement Garden at the Vista's terminus featured massive fountain complexes. Masséna imported over 150 pieces of French and Italian statuary. Marble figures lined pathways, bronze fountains marked intersections. Every element was chosen to evoke French aristocratic gardens while adapting to Delaware's climate and geography. That adaptation proved challenging. French plants often failed in American winters. Boxwood hedges required constant replacement. The hydraulic systems froze and cracked. Maintaining European perfection in American conditions required enormous resources. From the beginning, the gardens needed 30 to 40 full-time gardeners. Boxwood hedges required trimming every few weeks. Flowers had to be replanted seasonally, tens of thousands of bulbs annually. Fountains needed constant repairs. Marble statuary required cleaning and preservation. The vista alignment demanded precise maintenance. Any deviation was immediately visible. By 1910, Alfred and Alicia had their palace, 300 acres, a house that rivaled anything in Newport or on Fifth Avenue. Gardens that wouldn't be truly finished for another 2 decades. Tragically, John Mervyn Carrère would never see his creation mature. He died in a car accident in 1911. Just 1 year after Nemours was completed. Now Alfred and Alicia just had to fill their chateau with the life it was designed to contain. Running Nemours required 150 people, not guests, staff. The household operations alone employed between 40 and 50 indoor servants. The butler oversaw footmen who served at table and answered doors. The housekeeper managed maids who cleaned the 77 rooms. A French chef commanded the kitchen with multiple sous chefs and kitchen staff. Ladies' maids attended to Alicia's wardrobe and appearance. Valets served Alfred. Laundresses worked full-time in the estate's commercial-grade laundry facilities, changing all linens daily. Outdoors, the head gardener supervised 30 to 40 gardeners, depending on season. Spring and summer required maximum staff for planting and maintenance. Chauffeurs maintained and drove multiple automobiles. Gatekeepers manned the entry points. Plumbers, electricians, and carpenters were permanently employed to handle repairs and improvements. A specialist came regularly just to maintain the pipe organ's thousands of pipes and complex mechanisms. The annual payroll for staff alone ran between $125,000 and $175,000. In today's currency, approximately $3.75 to $5.25 million every year just for wages. Operational costs beyond payroll, food for family and staff, coal for heating, electricity, garden supplies, seeds and bulbs and fertilizer, maintenance and repairs easily added another $75,000 to $125,000 annually. Total operational costs reached between $200,000 and $300,000 per year in 1915 currency. In modern terms, $6 to $9 million annually. Alfred could afford it. His DuPont company dividends and other investments generated sufficient income. But the scale revealed something important. Nemours was designed to require massive ongoing expenditure. It could only exist with continuous infusions of wealth. Any interruption in that flow would begin the estate's decline immediately. Alicia embraced her role as hostess with enthusiasm. She wore elaborate gowns and jewels to dinners. She planned garden parties for over 100 guests. Musical evenings featured performances on the pipe organ. Holiday celebrations included elaborate Christmas decorations throughout the mansion. She was creating exactly the social world Alfred had promised her, a court where they made the rules and chose who attended. Dinners regularly seated 20 to 30 guests, with capacity for over 50 when needed. The dining room's crystal chandeliers and hand-painted ceiling panels provided the backdrop for formal service. Multiple courses arrived on silver platters, wine flowed from the extensive cellars. Conversation was supposed to sparkle, but something was missing. Many invitations went unanswered. Old line Philadelphia society stayed away. Most of the DuPont family remained absent. Some business associates attended. Certain family members who had sided with Alfred during the scandal came occasionally. But the social triumph Alicia had envisioned never quite materialized. The ostracism persisted despite the magnificence. Building a palace didn't erase the scandal. If anything, the grandeur highlighted their isolation. They had everything except acceptance. Alfred spent his days managing business affairs and overseeing estate operations. His deafness had worsened. By his mid-50s, he was nearly completely deaf. Primitive hearing aids helped somewhat, but made sustained conversation exhausting. He required written notes for business meetings. This physical limitation increased his natural reclusiveness. He had private quarters on the second floor, a suite including office, bedroom, and bathroom. He spent many evenings there, reading engineering reports and working on patent applications, while Alicia entertained guests downstairs. The irony was inescapable. He had built Nemours partly to establish an independent social court that didn't need DuPont family approval, but his stubbornness and the family feud meant the court never achieved the significance he wanted. The isolation he created through spite and pride became real isolation. The gardens bloomed, the fountains played, fresh flowers filled every room daily. The organ's pipes filled the music room with sound, and Alfred sat upstairs in his office, alone with his papers, unable to hear the party below. By 1919, Nemours was operating at full capacity. The gardens had never looked better. Thousands of flowers bloomed in perfect geometric patterns. The vista stretched flawlessly from the mansion to the achievement garden. The social calendar was full through the summer. Alicia was planning the spring garden party. But 100 miles away in Wilmington, Alfred's business empire was fracturing in ways that would haunt him for the rest of his life. While Alicia planned dinner parties and selected flowers for the conservatory, Alfred was fighting a war on two fronts. The United States government wanted to break up his company. His own cousins wanted to push him out of leadership. The battles happened simultaneously and drained him physically and emotionally. After the 1902 takeover, Alfred, Coleman, and Pierre had aggressively expanded DuPont's dominance. They acquired competitor after competitor. By 1907, DuPont controlled between 85% and 90% of the American explosives market. This was monopoly power equivalent to Standard Oil or U.S. Steel. The company set prices. Competitors either sold out or went bankrupt. Innovation came from DuPont laboratories or didn't come at all. The federal government noticed. Antitrust enforcement was popular during the Progressive Era. Presidents Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft had made trust-busting a signature policy. In 1912, the government sued DuPont under the Sherman Antitrust Act. The case dragged through courts for years. Eventually, DuPont was forced to divest certain operations. The company was broken into DuPont, Hercules Powder Company, and Atlas Powder Company. But DuPont retained the most valuable assets, the most advanced laboratories, and the strongest market position. The breakup hurt, but didn't destroy the company's power. Then came the First World War. When fighting began in Europe in August of 1914, American companies suddenly faced unprecedented demand for explosives. DuPont supplied the Allied forces, Britain and France primarily. Contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars flowed into Wilmington. Factory production ran 24 hours daily. New facilities were constructed. Employment exploded. Company profits during the war years were astronomical. Alfred's personal wealth grew from approximately $20 million in 1914 to between $35 and $50 million by 1920. These windfall profits funded Nemours operations and the ongoing garden development. Without the war profits, Alfred might have struggled to maintain the estate at peak operational levels. He was building a French château, with money earned destroying French châteaux. The irony apparently didn't trouble him. But the war profits also exposed tensions within the DuPont family leadership. Coleman DuPont, who had been president since 1902, wanted to sell his shares in the company. His health was declining, and he needed cash for other investments. In 1915, he offered his shares to Alfred first, as a courtesy to his cousin and former partner. Alfred couldn't raise the cash quickly enough. DuPont Company stock was valuable, but not highly liquid. Alfred's wealth was tied up in the company itself, in real estate, and in the estate. He needed time to arrange financing. Coleman grew impatient. Pierre DuPont stepped in with an offer. He would buy Coleman's shares using company funds. The legality was questionable. Using corporate money to buy out a major shareholder benefited Pierre personally, while potentially harming other shareholders. Alfred protested. He sued. The legal battle consumed years and cost hundreds of thousands in legal fees. Alfred lost. Pierre gained control of the company. Coleman was out. Alfred remained vice president in name, but was effectively pushed aside from real decision-making authority. Bow. 1920. Pierre controlled DuPont. Alfred collected his dividends and nursed his grievances. The 1915 betrayal deepened the family breach beyond repair. Coleman had been Alfred's partner. Pierre had been his ally. Both had turned against him, or at minimum had put their own interests ahead of his. The ostracism that began with his second marriage was now reinforced by business betrayal. Alfred concluded that the family he had helped make wealthy had repaid him with exile. He withdrew further into Nemours. He focused on philanthropic projects in Delaware, building highways and funding hospitals. He planned for his legacy beyond the company. Coleman wanted control of DuPont. Pierre wanted control of DuPont. Alfred wanted to be left alone with his estate and his dignity. By 1920, he had lost control of the family company, but kept the dividend checks. He had more money than he could spend in several lifetimes. What he didn't have was time. What he was about to lose was far more precious than corporate control. Alicia Bradford Maddox DuPont died on January 28, 1920. Heart disease complicated by kidney failure took her suddenly. Alfred was 55 years old and had just lost the only person who understood why Nemours mattered. She had shared his vision for the estate. She had been the social engine that brought life to the empty rooms. She had loved the gardens and the parties and the performance of aristocratic living. Without her, the chateau became a mausoleum. Alfred was devastated. Friends reported he seemed lost in the months following her death. The gardens she had loved continued blooming on schedule. The staff maintained their routines, but the purpose was gone. Alicia had wanted Nemours as a stage for social triumph. Alfred had wanted it as vindication against family rejection. With her gone, the vindication felt hollow. Less than a year later, in 1921, Alfred married Jessie Ball. She was a schoolteacher from Virginia, from a respectable but middle-class family. She was 45 years old. Alfred was 56. The age difference was less dramatic than his wealth difference from her background. Jessie was intelligent, educated, and completely unprepared for life as mistress of Nemours. She was nothing like Alicia. Alicia had been vivacious, social, ambitious. Jessie was quiet, private, and content with simpler pleasures. Alicia had loved grand dinners and elaborate gowns. Jessie preferred quiet evenings and intellectual conversation. The DuPont family, of course, disapproved of this marriage too. It was too quick after Alicia's death. Jessie's social background was wrong. Alfred was making another mistake. The criticism barely registered with him anymore. He had stopped caring what the family thought. Life at Nemours changed fundamentally. The entertaining stopped almost entirely. Jessie had no interest in hosting society. The ballroom sat dark. The dining room's capacity for 50 guests went unused. The pipe organ went largely unplayed. The grand rooms Alfred and Alicia had filled with guests now echoed emptily. Staff levels were gradually reduced, though the estate still required substantial personnel. By the late 1920s, employment had dropped from 150 to perhaps 70 or 80. Still substantial, but a significant reduction. The gardens were maintained but less as a showcase and more as Alfred's private refuge. He walked the paths daily when weather permitted. The vista still stretched perfectly aligned, the fountains still played, the flowers still bloomed in their seasonal patterns. But few people saw them besides Alfred, Jessie, and the gardeners. Alfred's deafness had progressed to near total by his 60s. Communication required written notes almost exclusively. This made socializing nearly impossible. He spent more time in Florida, where he had begun acquiring vast land holdings in the 1920s. Florida was warmer, less expensive to maintain property, and offered opportunities for development that Delaware couldn't match. He built a winter estate there, but Nemours remained his primary residence. His focus shifted increasingly to philanthropy. He established trust funds for Delaware children. He planned the Alfred I DuPont Hospital for Children, which would open in 1940. 5 years after his death, he built highways across Delaware. He funded schools and parks. He wanted his legacy to be more than family feuds and a beautiful house, but the house consumed his thoughts during his final years. He worked obsessively on his will. What would happen to Nemours after he died? It was too large for one person, too expensive for most institutions, too specialized to convert easily to other uses. He knew Jessie couldn't maintain it alone. She would need help. She would need resources. She would need clear instructions. Alfred Irénée DuPont died at Nemours on April 28, 1935. He was 70 years old. Jessie was with him. He was buried in a private mausoleum on the Nemours grounds, overlooking the gardens he had spent 25 years perfecting. His estate was valued at approximately $40 to $50 million. Substantial, but not as large as it had been before the Depression. The stock market crash of 1929 had reduced everyone's paper wealth significantly. He left Jessie wealthy beyond what she had ever imagined. He also left her a 300-acre estate that cost a fortune to maintain and couldn't be sold. She was 51 years old. She would live with this burden for 35 more years, struggling with a question that had no good answer. What do you do with a palace built for spite when the man who needed the spite is gone? Jessie Ball DuPont inherited a palace she never wanted and couldn't afford to leave. Alfred's will gave her the estate and sufficient assets to maintain it. But sufficient proved to be a relative term. What seemed adequate in 1935 became increasingly strained as decades passed and costs escalated faster than investment returns. The immediate challenges were manageable. Jessie had inherited wealth and the estate's operations were established. But the Second World War brought complications. Staff became impossible to find, as young men went to military service and young women took factory jobs. The estate was briefly considered for government use as a hospital or headquarters, but was deemed unsuitable. Jessie reduced staff from the already diminished levels of Alfred's final years. By the late 1940s, perhaps 50 to 60 people worked at Nemours. This was barely sufficient to maintain basic operations. The 1950s brought the maintenance crisis that would define Jessie's relationship with the estate. Systems installed in 1910 were failing after 40 years of use. The roof required complete replacement. Original slate tiles had cracked and allowed water infiltration. Plumbing throughout the mansion needed updating. Copper pipes had corroded. Electrical systems were obsolete and dangerous. The heating plant was inefficient and constantly breaking down. The gardens had declined significantly from their 1930s peak. Boxwood hedges had grown wild or died from disease. Flower beds went unplanted. Fountains sat dry because the hydraulic systems had failed. The marble statuary was weathering badly, surface deterioration from decades of freeze-thaw cycles. The colonnade's 157 columns needed individual assessment and repair. Some had cracks that threatened structural integrity. Jessie spent millions from her inheritance on maintenance and repairs. She hired contractors to replace the roof. She updated mechanical systems room by room. She brought in landscape architects to assess the gardens and create restoration plans. Every project revealed new problems. The house was simply too large and too complex for efficient maintenance. Repairing one system stressed another. Fixing visible problems often uncovered hidden damage. By the 1960s, operational costs had reached $1 million annually. This was in 1960s currency. Investment returns on her inheritance could cover much of this, but not all. She was slowly depleting principal. Simple mathematics showed that the trajectory was unsustainable. Without significant new capital, the estate would eventually exhaust her resources. Jessie was aging and had no heirs. Alfred's children from his first marriage had their own lives and inheritances. None wanted Nemours. The estate's future became her obsession. She explored every option she could imagine. She contacted museums. Would the Metropolitan Museum of Art or the Winterthur Museum want Nemours? They thanked her for thinking of them and politely declined. The operational costs alone made it impossible. Museums survived on endowments and admissions. Nemours would require massive subsidies. The location in Wilmington, not a major cultural destination, made the economics even worse. She approached the University of Delaware. Would they want the estate for a conference center or graduate school campus? The university conducted feasibility studies. The cost to modify the interior for institutional use would run $10 to $20 million. The ongoing maintenance would strain the university's budget indefinitely. They respectfully declined. She considered converting the mansion to a hotel or conference center. Consultants reviewed the property and delivered bad news. The interior would need to be gutted and rebuilt to modern hotel codes. The historic features that made it valuable would be destroyed in the conversion. The economics didn't work. Wilmington didn't have the tourist traffic to support a luxury hotel. Corporate conferences could be held anywhere. Why choose an expensive Delaware château when Philadelphia was 30 miles away with better facilities? She explored using it as a hospital or school. The location was wrong. Access was difficult. Parking was insufficient. The building's layout, designed for elegant entertaining, was unsuitable for institutional purposes. Modification costs were prohibitive. The fundamental problem became clear. No one wanted Nemours. Any use beyond private residence required massive capital investment and guaranteed ongoing losses. The estate was too expensive to operate, too specialized to convert, too isolated to attract sufficient visitors or guests to break even. It was a beautiful white elephant. Jessie developed her solution in the 1960s. She would create a charitable foundation. She would endow it with her estate, approximately $300 million. The foundation would have two missions: maintain Nemours as a museum open to the public and fund children's health care in Delaware. This honored Alfred's memory through preservation while serving Delaware's children, a cause Alfred had supported with his hospital plans. She believed this solved the problem. The endowment would be large enough to generate income for both missions. The estate would be preserved for future generations. Children would receive medical care. Alfred's legacy would be secured. She spent years with lawyers crafting the will. Every detail was specified. The foundation must maintain the estate. It must open Nemours to the public. It must use the endowment to fund both preservation and health care. What Jessie didn't fully calculate were the long-term costs. $300 million seemed like an inexhaustible sum. Generate even a modest 5% return. And that's $15 million annually. Surely enough for everything. But she was thinking about costs as they existed in the 1960s. She couldn't foresee how inflation, regulations, specialized conservation requirements, and rising labor costs would escalate expenses faster than endowment growth over the following decades. She also didn't anticipate how the two missions would conflict. Every dollar spent on Nemours was a dollar not spent on healthcare. The estate would never generate enough revenue to be self-sustaining. That meant permanent subsidies from the endowment. Those subsidies would grow over time as costs increased and revenue remained flat. Eventually, the foundation would face an impossible choice that the will prevented them from making. Jessie Ball DuPont died on September 5, 1970. She was 86 years old. She had lived at Nemours for 35 years, longer than Alfred had. She had watched the estate decline despite her best efforts. She had wrestled with the burden of preservation. She had created what she believed was a permanent solution. When the Nemours Foundation inherited the estate, they discovered she had been wrong. The estate was falling apart. Restoring it would cost millions. Operating it would cost millions more. Forever. In 1970, the Nemours Foundation's trustees faced a choice: spend millions restoring an estate that would never generate profit, or let a national historic landmark decay. Jessie's will gave them no choice. The legal language was explicit and binding. They were required to maintain the property and open it to the public. Donor intent in charitable trusts is nearly sacred in American law. Breaking the will would require proving it was impossible to fulfill. The foundation had $300 million. Impossible would be hard to argue. The trustees commissioned a complete assessment of the property's condition. Engineers, architects, conservators, and landscape specialists spent months documenting every problem. Their report was devastating. The estate had suffered 35 years of declining maintenance. Systems were failing throughout. The interior had deteriorated. The gardens were wilderness. The cost to restore everything to museum quality would be between $15 and $20 million in 1970s currency. In today's terms, approximately $100 million. The foundation debated their obligation. They were established to fund children's health care. That was Jessie's primary stated mission. The estate preservation was secondary, but the will treated both as mandatory. $15 to $20 million spent on an empty mansion was $15 to $20 million not spent treating children. The ethical problem was stark, but so was the legal requirement. In 1972, they committed to a comprehensive restoration. The project would take 5 years and cost $16 million. They hired the best specialists money could buy, architects who understood Beaux-Arts design, conservators who specialized in early 20th century interiors, craftsmen who could replicate vanished techniques, landscape architects who had studied French formal gardens. The money flowed. The roof came off completely. New slate replaced the failed original. Every tile was individually placed to match the original pattern. Underneath, structural timbers were assessed and repaired or replaced. Waterproofing was installed using modern materials hidden behind period-appropriate facades. The entire mechanical system was rebuilt from scratch. New heating, ventilation, and air conditioning maintained precise temperature and humidity for conservation purposes, while remaining as invisible as possible. Plumbing throughout the house was replaced. Electrical was updated to modern safety codes using period-style fixtures. All 77 rooms received attention. Interior restoration required painstaking research. Paint analysis revealed original colors. Wallpaper patterns were documented and reproduced. Benot carpets were rewoven to match fragments. The furniture collection was conserved piece by piece. French paneling was stabilized and cleaned. The marble throughout the house, floors and staircases and bathroom walls was professionally cleaned and sealed. Crystal chandeliers were disassembled, cleaned, repaired, and rewired. The Aeolian pipe organ alone cost over $500,000 to restore. Every pipe was removed, cleaned, and tested. The mechanism was completely rebuilt. New leather was installed where old had deteriorated. The console was refinished. When the work was complete, the organ could reproduce everything from Bach to early 20th century popular music with crystalline clarity. It was one of the finest residential organs in America and now one of the best maintained. The gardens required comprehensive restoration based on historical photographs and surviving plans. The boxwood maze was replanted with disease-resistant varieties. where original plants had died. Parterres were reconstructed to exact specifications. The reflecting pools were drained, waterproofed, and rebuilt. The fountain systems received completely new hydraulics. Every one of the 157 Carrara marble columns in the colonnade was individually assessed. Cracked columns were replaced with new marble carved to match. Statuary throughout the gardens was cleaned and conserved. Some pieces required structural reinforcement. The Achievement Garden fountains were completely rebuilt. Museum conversion required additional modifications. Tour routes were established with velvet ropes and protective barriers to keep visitors from damaging interiors. Museum-quality lighting was installed to illuminate the spaces while protecting light-sensitive materials. Sophisticated climate control maintained stable conditions year-round. Fire suppression systems were hidden within the architecture. Security systems with motion detectors and cameras were discreetly integrated. Outbuildings were converted to visitor facilities. One building became the visitor center with restrooms, a gift shop, and orientation exhibits. Parking areas were established away from the mansion where cars wouldn't intrude on the historic viewshed. Educational spaces were created in former service buildings for school programs and lectures. In 1977, after 5 years of work and $16 million in spending, the Nemours Estate opened to the public. The foundation established restrictive access policies designed to protect the property while providing meaningful visitor experiences. Tours were by reservation only. Group sizes were kept small, never more than 15 or 20 people. All tours were guided. No self-touring was permitted. This protected the interiors but also limited capacity. Admission fees were set high by the standards of the late 1970s, $15 to $20 per person when many museums charged $5 or less. The foundation reasoned that high fees would attract serious visitors while discouraging casual tourism that might damage the property. They also needed revenue. Operating costs were projected at $2 to $3 million annually. Ticket sales needed to cover as much as possible. The reality disappointed from the beginning. Nemours is located in Wilmington, Delaware. Wilmington is not a major tourist destination. It has no international airport. It's not on most tourist itineraries. Philadelphia is 30 miles away and offers world-class museums. Washington, D.C. is under 2 hours south. New York is 2 hours north. Tourists visiting the Mid-Atlantic region rarely included Wilmington in their plans. Annual attendance settled around 20 to 30,000 visitors. Some years were better, some were worse, but the estate never attracted anything approaching the numbers at comparable properties. Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina drew over 1 million visitors annually. Hearst Castle in California attracted 500,000. The Breakers in Newport saw 400,000. Nemours drew 30,000 on a good year. The mathematics were brutal. Annual operating costs ran between $2 and $3 million. Admission revenue, gift shop sales, and limited event rentals generated perhaps $500,000 to $800,000. The annual deficit was between $1.5 and $2.5 million every single year. The foundation's endowment had to cover the difference every single year. Over time, the cumulative impact became staggering. 10 years of $2 million annual deficits equaled $20 million drawn from the endowment. 20 years meant $40 million. The investment returns on the endowment needed to be strong enough to cover both the annual deficits and the growth in costs from inflation. Medical mission spending also needed to grow to keep pace with healthcare cost inflation. The endowment was being pulled in multiple directions simultaneously. The foundation tried to increase revenue. They expanded the gift shop. They added a cafe. They created special events and educational programs. They made the gardens available for high-end weddings and corporate events at premium prices. A wedding at Nemours could cost $50,000 to $100,000. The gardens were spectacular. The exclusivity appealed to certain clients, but these events were limited. The property could only host so many without damaging the gardens and disrupting regular operations. Revenue improved marginally, but never enough to close the gap. By the 1990s, the pattern was clear. The estate would never break even. Not in 1 year. Not ever. The foundation would subsidize Nemours from the endowment in perpetuity, or until the will could be broken. Legal experts researched whether the will could be challenged. Donor intent is heavily protected in trust law. Courts are extremely reluctant to override a donor's explicit instructions. The foundation had substantial assets. Arguing that maintaining Nemours was impossible, would be difficult when they clearly could afford it, even if doing so diverted resources from children's health care. The Cypre doctrine allows courts to modify charitable trusts when the original purpose becomes impractical or impossible. But the bar is high. The foundation would need to prove that Jessie's dual mandate was fundamentally unworkable. They would need to show that maintaining the estate actively harmed the healthcare mission. This would require lengthy, expensive litigation with uncertain outcomes, and even if they won, the publicity would be terrible. A children's healthcare foundation suing to abandon a historic estate so they could spend more on sick children. The optics were complicated at best, so the subsidies continued, year after year. The foundation's trustees knew the mathematics. They knew their primary mission. They were legally bound to both. The beautiful palace Alfred built to prove his independence had become a trap that his widow's good intentions had made permanent. In 2025, the Nemours Foundation operates children's hospitals in Delaware and Florida. They treat thousands of sick children annually. They fund pediatric research. They provide care to families regardless of ability to pay. Their Nemours Children's Hospital facilities are consistently ranked among the finest pediatric centers in America, and every year they spend $3.5 million maintaining an empty mansion in Wilmington that 25,000 people visit. The 21st century has brought challenges Jessie never imagined. Climate change creates new threats to the historic property. More severe storms damage the gardens and stress the mansion's envelope. Extreme heat waves strain the climate control systems. Freeze-thaw cycles have intensified, accelerating deterioration of exterior stonework. Insurance costs for historic properties have skyrocketed as carriers reassess risk in an era of increasing natural disasters. The gardens face biological threats. Boxwood blight, a fungal disease that appeared in the United States in the 2000s, has threatened the historic hedges that define the formal parterres. Treatment requires aggressive fungicide programs. Affected plants must be removed and burned to prevent spread. Replanting with disease-resistant varieties maintains the visual effect but sacrifices the genetic authenticity of the original plantings. The foundation has spent hundreds of thousands fighting the blight with limited success. Invasive plant species threaten the historic landscapes. Non-native plants introduced decades ago have spread aggressively. Removing them without damaging historic plantings requires careful handwork. Herbicides risk killing desirable plants. The labor costs are substantial. Climate shifts mean that some historic plant varieties no longer thrive in Delaware's changing conditions. Maintaining the gardens as Messina designed them requires fighting against ecological succession and climate adaptation simultaneously. Finding skilled craftsmen has become increasingly difficult. The specialized skills required for historic preservation, marble carving, French polishing, gilding, hand-weaving historical textile patterns, exist in a shrinking pool of master craftsmen. Many are aging with few apprentices learning the trades. When work is needed, the foundation must sometimes fly in specialists from Europe. Costs that seem manageable in the 1970s have increased at rates far exceeding general inflation. The Aeolian pipe organ requires $50,000 to $100,000 in annual maintenance. The mechanism is complex and fragile. Climate fluctuations affect the wooden pipes. Leather components deteriorate and need replacement. Only a handful of organ technicians in America have the expertise to work on instruments this sophisticated. They command premium rates. The organ is magnificent. It's also a financial sinkhole. The COVID-19 pandemic created an unprecedented crisis. In March of 2020, the estate closed completely. No visitors, no tours, no events, zero admission revenue. The closure lasted approximately 15 months. During that time, maintenance costs continued. Climate control couldn't be shut off without risking damage to historic materials. Gardens couldn't stop growing. Staff had to be retained to maintain basic operations. The foundation covered 100% of costs from the endowment for over a year. When the estate reopened in mid-2021, attendance was slow to recover. Many people remained hesitant about indoor activities. Tour capacity was reduced for social distancing. Enhanced cleaning protocols added labor costs. As of 2025, attendance has not returned to pre-pandemic levels. The foundation projects it may take several more years to rebuild to the 25,000 to 30,000 annual visitors they averaged before. Current annual operating costs run between $3 and $4 million. Admission revenue, events, and gift shop sales generate approximately $500 to $800,000. The annual deficit is therefore between $2.5 and $3.5 million. Multiply that by the 55 years since Jessie's death in 1970. The cumulative subsidies total between $125 and $175 million, drawn from an endowment meant primarily for children's health care. To put that in medical terms, $150 million could fund approximately 15,000 pediatric surgeries at $10,000 each. It could build multiple hospital wings. It could endow research programs studying childhood diseases. It could provide free care to thousands of families who cannot afford treatment. Instead, it maintains gardens that cost $500,000 annually to keep the hedges trimmed. The Foundation's trustees wrestle with this reality constantly. They understand the ethical dilemma. Every board meeting includes discussions about the estate's drag on resources. Staff prepares annual reports showing the cumulative cost. Everyone knows the numbers. Everyone understands what that money could do for children. But Jessie's will remains ironclad. 75 years of legal precedent protecting donor intent makes challenging the will nearly impossible. The estate cannot be sold. The will explicitly forbids it. Even if the legal prohibition could be overcome, who would buy it? No private individual could afford the operational costs. Corporations don't want historic estates as headquarters. They want modern, efficient buildings. Universities don't want the burden. Museums can't afford it. Government has no interest. There is no market for a property that requires $3 to $4 million annually just to keep the lights on and the grass cut. The property cannot be demolished. It's listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It's designated a National Historic Landmark. Delaware state preservation laws add additional protections. The architectural and historical significance is undeniable. Destroying one of America's finest Beaux-Arts estates would trigger lawsuits from preservation groups and likely lose. The negative publicity would be catastrophic for the Foundation. The estate cannot be neglected. Beyond the legal obligations in the will, the Foundation has ethical responsibilities. They accepted the property and the endowment. They opened it to the public. They presented themselves as stewards. Walking away would betray that trust. Allowing deliberate deterioration would violate their fiduciary duties as trustees. They're trapped. The property cannot be made profitable. They've tried. Marketing budgets have increased. Partnership arrangements with hotels in Wilmington bring tour groups. Educational programs target schools. Special events maximize use of the gardens. Nothing closes the $2 to $3 million annual gap. Location is destiny. Wilmington is not and will never be Asheville or Newport or coastal California. The visitor numbers required to break even, probably 200 to 300,000 annually, are simply impossible in this location with these access restrictions. The Foundation continues to operate Nemours as a museum. Tours run Tuesday through Sunday from May through December. The mansion is closed January through April for winter maintenance and to reduce heating costs. Reservations are still required, though the process is now online. Tour groups remain small to protect interiors. The guided tours last approximately 2 hours and cover the main rooms and gardens. Admission in 2,025 runs, $20 to $25 per person for the full mansion and gardens tour. Gardens-only tickets are available for $10 to $15. The property still hosts weddings and corporate events in the gardens. These command premium prices, $50,000 and up for exclusive use. The revenue helps but remains a fraction of operating costs. The Foundation must balance revenue generation against property protection. Too many events damage the historic gardens and disrupt the museum experience for regular visitors. Special programs continue. Garden days celebrate horticultural excellence. School groups receive subsidized access for educational programs. Partnerships with the University of Delaware support research on Beaux-Arts architecture and landscape design. Volunteer programs engage master gardeners and trained docents. The Foundation tries to maximize the estate's educational and cultural value even as they question the financial sustainability. Behind the scenes, strategic discussions continue about the long-term future. Foundation leadership understands that the current model cannot continue indefinitely. The endowment is not infinite. Medical costs inflate faster than investment returns. At some point, perhaps decades from now, perhaps sooner, the mathematics will force a crisis. The question is whether the foundation should act preemptively or wait for the crisis to arrive. Options under consideration include creative reinterpretations of the will's requirements. What constitutes adequate maintenance? Could selective areas be closed to reduce costs? Could portions of the gardens be converted to less maintenance-intensive sustainable landscaping while preserving the key vista and formal parterres? Could some rooms be mothballed rather than climate-controlled year-round? These approaches would reduce costs but also diminish the property's significance. And they would certainly trigger legal challenges from preservation groups arguing the foundation is violating the will. Another option is seeking legislative relief. The Delaware state legislature could theoretically pass a law modifying the terms of Jessie's charitable trust in the public interest. Precedent exists for such interventions in extreme circumstances, but the political will is uncertain. The foundation would need to make a public case that maintaining the estate actively harms children's health care. The resulting publicity would be intense and potentially damaging regardless of outcome. The least palatable option is simply continuing as they are and waiting for future generations to deal with the problem. The foundation could maintain operations indefinitely, subsidizing the annual deficits from the endowment, and hope that somehow circumstances change. Perhaps Wilmington becomes a major tourist destination. Perhaps some future innovation makes the economics work. Perhaps future trustees find a solution current leadership cannot imagine. This is not a strategy. It's a hope, but it may be all they have. Before Biltmore, before the Breakers, before the Gilded Age filled Fifth Avenue with marble palaces, there were other American fortunes. The DuPont family built their wealth on gunpowder and chemicals, not railroads or steel. They controlled an entire state through industrial dominance. Alfred I DuPont built Nemours, slightly after the technical Gilded Age ended, but with all the same impulses driving him: ambition, display, legacy, the need to prove something to a family that had rejected him. He succeeded in building something magnificent. The château he erected in 1910 represents Beaux-Arts architecture at its finest American expression. The gardens Gabriel Massena created rank among the most beautiful formal landscapes in the country. The craftsmanship throughout the mansion, the carved marble, the French paneling, the crystal chandeliers, can never be replicated at any price. Those skills and that dedication to perfection no longer exist. Most Gilded Age estates are gone, demolished for office towers and parking lots, sold and subdivided, stripped for materials, and abandoned. The ones that survive often survive by accident or by transformation. Biltmore remains in the Vanderbilt family and operates profitably as a major tourist attraction in tourist-rich Asheville. Hearst Castle was donated to California and is maintained with taxpayer funding as a state park. The Breakers is owned by the Preservation Society of Newport County, which operates multiple historic houses and can spread overhead costs. Nemours survives, but survives as a burden. A private foundation legally bound by an ironclad will maintains it at a cost of millions annually. The foundation's primary mission is treating sick children. Every dollar spent on trimming boxwood hedges is a dollar not spent on pediatric surgery. The mathematics are stark and unavoidable. Over 55 years, the cumulative cost has reached $150 million or more. That money has maintained empty rooms and perfect garden vistas. It could have saved thousands of children's lives. Alfred wanted to prove he didn't need his family's approval. He built a palace that outdid anything the DuPonts had created before. He established his independence from their judgment. He created his own court with its own rules. He succeeded completely. The estate still stands. The family is gone or scattered or irrelevant. Nemours outlasted the feud that created it. Jessie wanted to honor Alfred's memory while helping Delaware's children. She believed a large enough endowment could accomplish both. She spent years crafting a will that would ensure permanent preservation and permanent charitable giving. She meant well. Her intentions were entirely honorable. What she created was a permanent conflict between two worthy goals, with no mechanism to resolve the tension when, not if, they came into competition. The Nemours Foundation inherited both a magnificent estate and a moral dilemma. Trustees understand their obligations to both missions. They can read the annual financial reports. They can calculate the opportunity costs. They know what $150 million in cumulative subsidies means in terms of children who could have been treated, research that could have been funded, care that could have been provided. They also know what Jessie's will requires. They're bound legally and ethically to both responsibilities. This raises questions that have no easy answers. What do we owe to the past? Historic preservation serves real cultural purposes. It connects us to our history. It preserves craftsmanship and artistry that can never be reproduced. It provides educational value. Future generations deserve access to these monuments of American wealth and achievement. But when does preserving history become harmful? When does honoring the dead injure the living? At what point do the costs of maintaining the past outweigh the benefits? Should donor intent be absolute? American philanthropy is built on respecting donors' wishes. People who give money to charitable causes deserve to have their intentions honored. But Jessie died in 1970. The world has changed enormously in 55 years. Costs have escalated in ways she couldn't foresee. Should her instructions from 1965 bind the foundation forever? Regardless of circumstances, should there be mechanisms to adapt charitable trusts when the original terms create unintended harms? Can beauty justify ongoing harm? Nemours is breathtaking. The gardens are extraordinary. The architecture is sublime. Walking through the estate is genuinely moving for anyone who appreciates design and craftsmanship. But that beauty is maintained at the cost of resources that could treat children with cancer. It's maintained by diverting money from a children's hospital foundation. The trade-off is not abstract. It's real, measurable, and ongoing. The numbers don't lie. 3 to 4 million annually. 500 to 800,000 in revenue. 2.5 to 3.5 million in annual deficits. 125 to 175 million over 55 years. Thousands of children who could have been treated. The foundation writes those checks every year. The gardens bloom every spring. The fountains run every summer. The mansion sits mostly empty. The contradiction persists. The estate still stands in 2025. Tours continue on schedule. The gardens maintain their geometric perfection. The boxwood hedges are trimmed every few weeks. The flowers are replanted seasonally. The fountains play. The marble statuary is cleaned and conserved. The pipe organ receives its annual maintenance. Visitors walk through the rooms where Alfred and Alicia once entertained guests who rarely came. They admire the French paneling and the crystal chandeliers. They stroll the gardens Gabriel Massena spent 22 years creating. 25,000 people annually experience something genuinely beautiful and historically significant. The foundation continues wrestling with the dilemma. Board meetings include discussions that go nowhere. Staff prepares reports that change nothing. The will remains unbroken. The subsidies continue. The healthcare mission competes with the preservation mission for resources. Both are important. Both are mandated. Neither can be abandoned. There is no solution that satisfies everyone. There may be no solution at all. Alfred I DuPont died in 1935 believing he had secured his legacy. He built something magnificent. He established his name permanently in Delaware. He created beauty that would outlast the family feud that motivated its construction. He was right about all of that. Nemours still stands. It's still beautiful. It still bears his name. Jessie Ball DuPont died in 1970 believing she had honored his memory while helping children. She created a foundation with resources to do both. She wrote a will that would ensure permanent preservation and permanent charitable giving. She thought $300 million would be enough forever. She meant every word of her instructions. Her intentions were pure. They were both right, and they were both wrong. Nemours stands today as one of America's finest French Revival estates. The gardens rank among the most beautiful formal landscapes in the country. The mansion preserves Gilded Age craftsmanship that will never be replicated. Visitors who tour the property experience something genuinely special. The architectural and historical significance is undeniable. The foundation also spends millions every year maintaining this empty palace, while their primary mission is saving children's lives. The estate loses money every single year. It has lost over $100 million cumulatively. It will never break even. The burden falls on resources meant for pediatric health care. The foundation cannot sell it, cannot demolish it, cannot neglect it, cannot make it profitable. Jessie's will ensures the estate will outlast everyone currently wrestling with the problem. It will outlast their children. It will outlast their grandchildren. Alfred got his immortality. The chateau he built to prove he didn't need his family's approval will stand long after every DuPont alive today is gone. The question is whether immortality is always worth the price, whether beauty justifies ongoing harm, whether honoring the dead should constrain the living forever. The Nemours Foundation has no good answers. They just have the checks they write every year and the children they can't treat, because the money went to trimming hedges in a garden built from spite.